They say some nights don't just arrive, they descend, thick as grief, sharp as a broken bottle. And if you've ever stood in a field while the wind hunted through the fence line and the sky chewed on lightning, you know the difference. So before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story reaches you anywhere near the heart, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because on the night the ash fell sideways and the snow stung like salt, a ruined farm, a bad history, and one battered gelding offered up the kind of courage you can't learn, only recognize when it shows itself. It started with the color of the storm. Not gray, not honest black, but a bruised purple that told you the weather held a grudge. Wind licked the pasture short and mean, rattling the sheet metal like loose teeth. And somewhere beyond the cottonwoods a siren wheezed and died as if even alarms felt useless this far from town. I was counting hay I didn't have and failures I'd already spent when the smell hit. Smoke braided with snow. That wrong marriage? And then a dull orange rose above the northern hedgerow. The exact shade of a memory I had tried to bury 3 winters ago, when everything I loved burned while I was close enough to hear boards scream and too far to do anything but live with it. I saddled Blaze without thinking. He's no beauty, scar on the withers from old fence, a clouded chip in the left eye, knees that tell you the weather an hour early. But he moves through panic like it owes him money, and when the wind slapped us sideways he squared under me as if anchoring both of us to the earth. By the time we crested the lane, the old Harper place was a red lung exhaling sparks. The main barn had already lost its roof, flames lifting and folding like a sail in heavy sea, and the house wore a shawl of smoke that made it look 90 instead of 40. Tracks stitched the driveway, pickup gone, maybe for help, but there was still a shape by the porch, small, stubborn, waving both arms as if swatting the storm. It was Mina Harper, 13 going on iron, and her face had that particular white that isn't fear yet, just the absence of everything else. "They said leave it," she yelled above the wind. But the foaling mare's still inside, starling, she went down. And the colt, she didn't finish because the fire took a breath and coughed bright, and she had to throw her arm across her eyes. You don't debate when a child throws you a life like that. You either catch it, or you live with knowing you didn't. We cut for the side door where the breeze set the smoke drawing low instead of driving it flat, and Blaze came to a square halt the way he does when his brain is 3 feet ahead of his feet. I dropped, shoved the scarf up over my nose, and put my shoulder to the door that remembered a time when it hung straight. Heat has a language. This was still words. Not yet a scream. And in the red-brown of the alleyway haze I could see shapes resolving into stalls, tools fallen like arguments, and far down the center a star-flecked rump thrashing in straw. "Easy, girl," I lied because Easy had left the building. To the left a wall beam ticked, knees buckling, and when it dropped it sent sparks like startled birds across the aisle. Blaze stayed just inside the threshold in that way of his, close enough to pull me out if something fell, wise enough not to become tinder, ears pricked forward, jaw tight, listening for a change in the burning. I slid along the stalls on my hip, back to the boards, counting breaths the way the doctor taught me after Afghanistan when the nights got loud. At Starling's door the latch had warped, a blackened question mark, and the bottom hinge sagged so her shoulder jammed the jam with every effort. Her flank shone slick with sweat, eyes rolling white in an orbit of terror, and beyond her hock I saw 2 impossibly small hooves, slick with the unkind light of timing gone wrong. The mare had gone into labor at the worst hour of her life, and found her way to the worst angle of the worst stall. "We're not done," I told her, because sometimes lying is a kind of faith. I drove the heel of my glove under the latch, pride enough to make metal squeal, and Blaze, God bless the part of him that understands verbs, leaned his chest into the door from behind until wood gave with a sound like a rib cracking. Starling tried to surge and tangled herself worse, so I slid in on my knees, shoulder under her neck the way an old charo once taught me, hand on her blind side where touch says more than voice, talking low about nothing, fence lines, summer clover, the creek in October, until her breath found a rhythm that wasn't a death march. The foal was breech, hind first, and I didn't have time to fetch the foaling kit or even imagine sterile. I found both legs, felt the angle of hock and fetlock, waited for her contraction and pulled with the kind of careful that still counts as force. Outside, something deep collapsed and the pressure in the alley shifted. the fire's version of rehooking your fear, and Starling gave me one long rolling push that felt like a tide turning. The colt slithered into the world with a wet thud, and for a beat there was nothing but noise, the house popping, the wind harmonizing, my heart calling its own roll. He didn't breathe. Small enough I could make a cradle of my hands, big enough he could break me if I got this wrong. I cleared nose and mouth, rubbed ribs with burlap, bent and breathed my breath into his, counting like a medic, praying like a fool. One beat, two, the longest year, and then a shudder, a cough, a thin lamb bleat of a sound so brave it brings men to their knees. He wriggled enough to insult gravity, and Starling, who had been a lost thing a minute ago, lifted her head and decided to live because he was living. The beam in the alley groaned again, and the red brightened from argument to verdict. On your feet, I told them both, meaning all three of us. Starling tried, slid, tried again. We weren't going to make it down that aisle. Heat shoved at my cheeks like hands, and the air went from air to wrong. That's when Blaze made a choice I didn't know he had. I heard the rasp of his shoes on the concrete, the quick staccato step he uses when something is behind him he doesn't like, and then he vanished into the smoke right of the alley. A heartbeat later, a smaller, darker square opened where there had only been wall, an emergency hatch long painted shut. Now not, and he reappeared head low, snorting, a ridiculous old bay gelding with a door he had freed by sheer argument of chest and will. That's our road, I told Starling. Looped the makeshift strip of my scarf under her jaw, and we made a triangle. Mare leaning on me leaning on Blaze. The foal slung up in my arms like a sopping miracle, and we moved. Heat chased, straw flared at the corners of our vision, and every breath negotiated a price. But the square kept growing, and then we were in snow that hissed and died on our jackets, and outside so cold, it felt like mercy. Mina was there with the world's worst blanket, the kind that smells like the cupboard and hope, and she wrapped the foal and cried without noise, tears freezing at her chin like pearls. We hustled Starling to the lee of the well house where wind hit the building first, and I dragged a water trough under the eave drip to warm. Threw in 2 kettlefuls from the wood stove someone had thought to light in the pantry, and got the colt down where steam made its own weather. Blaze didn't stand still. He circled the yard with his ugly, perfect ears pointed at the dark, and twice he shouldered me when the wind skated the fire our direction, as if to say the line was here, not there. The volunteer truck finally shouldered up the lane, lights gone pale in the snow haze, and neighbors came like guilt, stamping, shouting offers, carrying more questions than water. Somewhere between the first hose stream and the second, the north fence popped like knuckles and a string of heifers broke, running blind along the ditch toward the county road. If they hit the culvert, they'll break legs, somebody yelled, and I saw 2 boys move like heroes until the wind shoved them back. I didn't think. I whistled the way I haven't whistled since I believed in cavalry, and Blaze came hard, set himself like a lineman, and we cut for the ditch. Snow hammered, ice bit, but he tracked the lead heifer the way some horses track a scent. Not a body, quick feet dancing on the lip, head angled so she couldn't see escape as anything but turning back toward safety. Twice she tried to take us with her into the black of the culvert, and twice Blaze gave her the shoulder the way an old ranch boss once gave mine, just enough to say I'm here and I'm not moving. The string folded like a bad hand, curved, and flowed back through the gap we made with our bodies. The boys slammed a panel across the break, and for a second the world let us have quiet. When I turned, Mina stood next to Starling, shivering, smiling, blood on her sleeve that didn't belong to her, and the colt had found a teat and was making that soft, rhythmic pool sound that says everything terrible had to wait its turn. The house survived 2 rooms and a kitchen wall. The barn lost half and kept the half that mattered. Sometime after midnight, the wind tired of itself and the snow fell straight, clean, as if ashamed. We put Starling and the colt in the south shed with straw high and dry, and I dug through the tack room for the old blue cooler that has saved more foals than common sense. Blaze stood in the doorway with his forelock iced in little commas, and I leaned my head against his wet shoulder and said nothing, which is the only appropriate prayer after a night like that. You'd think the story ends there, and if it did, it would be enough. But hurt doesn't keep a calendar. And grace doesn't either. In the morning, when steam rose off blackened beams and the sun made diamonds out of ash, the sheriff walked the property with a look that said the storm wasn't the whole story. Mina's father had left before the fire for town, diesel for the generator, and never made it back because on the county road somebody had thrown chain across the track and a tire and axle paid the bill. There'd been trouble brewing with a neighbor who wanted Harper land for the creek frontage. Words had been exchanged, gates found open, cattle shot at from the road. Snow tells truth. In the margin where the wind skipped there were prints that weren't boot or deer. Thin, half-mooned, like a lug pattern I recognized from a lifted truck with a particular whine. There are nights you survive, and mornings you decide who you are. We could have waited for town to chew on it. Instead, Mina stood with her chin up and her father's wrench in her hand and said, "We finished this," and somehow we meant all of us, the mare, the colt, the ugly bay, the man who knows too much about fire. We followed Prince to the South Arroyo where the cottonwoods make a blind, and there the track swung wide toward a corrugated shed that had never belonged to any map. Blaze's ears said we were not alone, and they were right. 3 men, 1 smirk, 2 cowards, a truck with fresh-scarred treads and chain in the bed. Maybe they wanted to talk. Maybe they wanted to brag. They didn't get the chance, because the sheriff stepped out behind them with a deputy and a camera, called in half the county, and the story got simple. Chain on the road, diesel siphoned, a jealous grievance turned to a felony, a fire that started on a corner the wind couldn't have touched on its own. They left in cuffs that chimed like little bells, and the valley remembered what laws were for. I spent the next week on a ladder, a shovel, a cot near the south shed door, sleeping when the colt slept and waking when Starling sighed too deep. Blaze divided his time between all of us, a guard who didn't need orders. He'd put his nose to the foal's hip, and the little thing would somehow stand better, as if balance could be borrowed, and when Mina's hands shook from cold or fear, Blaze would back a step and drop his head into her chest, the weight of him telling her what words can't. "You're here. That's enough." On day 9, the colt found a gallop, and the nearest wall at the same time and bounced off both, indignant and perfect. On day 10, Mina laughed in a way that startled birds into the clear. Spring came like it always does, late, rude, beautiful, and the ash turned the pasture a green richer than we had a right to, the way burned ground sometimes pays you back. People brought lumber, casseroles, opinions. We took the first 2 and smiled at the third. The house keeps a smoke shadow the paint won't cover, the kind you only see at certain angles. A reminder and a warning. The new barn has a side door wide enough for miracles, and the latch swings easy because a chest once taught it to behave. If you want a lesson, I can put on a pillow. I don't have one. I have this. When the worst thing arrives dressed like weather, you will find out who you are and who your horse is, and sometimes, if the math of mercy works out, you'll be both better than the sum. On cold evenings now, when the wind tries our windows and the foal, almost weaned, all legs and foolishness, tests fences with a joy that scares and saves in equal measure. Blaze stands at the gate with his one cloudy eye on the horizon that hurt us, and then chose not to. And I put my hand on the scar at his withers and think of doors that look like walls, until a horse decides otherwise. If this story carried you somewhere you needed to go, tell me where you're watching from. Share it with someone who keeps standing in their own fire, and subscribe if you want more nights that turn into mornings. The world will hand you ash and ice. If you're lucky, it will also hand you a partner with 4 legs and a ridiculous heart, and together you'll make a road through it, wide enough for a mare, a foal, a kid who refuses to look away, and a tired man who finally remembered how to be brave.